5 years ago, on the night the first blizzard of winter descended on Coldwater Hollow, a 60-year-old man sat on the edge of a collapsed platform at the town's abandoned rail station, a bottle of prescription pills rattling between his shaking palms. He had made his decision. There was no one left to call, no one left to miss him. The war had taken his brothers. The years after had taken his wife, his son, his home, his name. All that remained was the cold and the pills and the howling of a wind that sounded, in his worst moments, like the voices of men he had failed to save. He was 30 seconds from swallowing every last tablet when he heard it. Not a bark, not a growl, something smaller and more desperate than either. A sound like a question being asked by a creature that had already given up expecting an answer. A whimper, barely audible beneath the storm. The man's name was Arthur Briggs, and that thin, broken sound, the sound of something else on the edge of dying, would change everything. What happened that night in the snow and the dark, and what happened 5 years later when a corrupt sheriff pressed a gun barrel to the back of Arthur's skull, and what a scarred, half-deaf German shepherd named Rex did in the hours that followed. That is the story the world would eventually weep over. That is the story that begins with half a stale hamburger and ends with the kind of redemption that most people have stopped believing in. Listen closely, because what Rex did next will change what you think loyalty means. The abandoned Coldwater Hollow rail station sat at the western edge of town like a rotten tooth, something everyone agreed should have been pulled long ago, but which remained because removing it required effort, and effort required someone who cared. The platforms were buckled, the roof of the old ticket office had collapsed inward, and weeds pushed up through the concrete in thick, determined clusters that turned brittle and skeletal every December. Arthur Briggs had been sleeping there for 3 weeks. He had drifted into Coldwater Hollow the way he drifted everywhere, on foot, following roads that led away from wherever he had last been. He had served 2 tours in Fallujah and 1 in Kandahar, and he had come home to a country that thanked him with a pamphlet and a bus ticket. The PTSD came in waves at first, manageable waves he could outswim if he kept moving, kept busy, kept his mind anchored to the present. But grief is patient. It waits. It knows that a man can only keep moving for so long before his legs give out beneath him. His legs had given out in Coldwater Hollow. He had the pills because a VA clinic 2 counties over had prescribed them for sleep, and because he had been saving them, one by one, in a particular and deliberate way that he had not fully admitted to himself until he sat down on that platform and counted them and understood that he had saved enough. He was not angry. That was the thing people misunderstood about men like Arthur. They imagined despair as something loud and violent, a door slamming, a fist through drywall. But Arthur's despair was quiet. It was the absence of a reason to stand up in the morning. It was the hour-shaped holes in the day where someone, used to be. His wife Carol's voice, his son Danny's laugh. The weight of a rifle in familiar hands, surrounded by men he trusted with his life and who trusted him with theirs. All of it was gone. What remained was the outline, the negative space, the cold impression of a man pressed into the world and slowly fading. He held the bottle up and watched the pill shift inside it, white and small and very final. Then he heard it. He nearly dismissed it as wind. The storm had been building all evening, the sky pressing down like a gray iron lid, and the gusts were finding every gap in the station's ruined walls and producing sounds, moans, whistles, things that sounded almost like voices. Arthur was used to sounds that sounded almost like voices. He had learned not to follow them. But this was different. He sat very still and listened. And it came again, that small, ragged exhalation of pain, coming from somewhere beneath the collapsed section of the far platform, a sound so full of suffering and yet so devoid of self-pity that it stopped Arthur's hands where they were. He put the bottle in his pocket. He found the dog 20 feet away, wedged into the dark space between a toppled concrete block and the frozen earth, lying in a spreading stain of blood that had gone black in the cold. It was a German shepherd, or had been, once. Now it was a wreck. One ear had been torn and had healed badly, leaving a ragged notch that gave the left side of its face a permanently quizzical look. Its right flank bore a lattice of old scars, the kind that come from deliberate and repeated contact with something sharp. Its left hind leg was swollen to nearly twice the size of the right, and the way it lay suggested that moving it was no longer within the realm of possibility. It looked up at Arthur. Its eyes were amber, and they were perfectly clear, and in them was not the dull glaze of an animal that has already begun to slip away, but something far more disturbing, an active, aware, exhausted intelligence that had chosen to stop fighting not because it lacked the will, but because it had run out of reasons to continue. Arthur recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror for months. "Hey," he said. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "Hey, buddy." The dog did not lift its head, but its tail, that broken, battle-worn tail, shifted once in the frozen dirt. Just once. An acknowledgement, not a greeting. More like a soldier recognizing another soldier through the smoke. Arthur crouched down and looked at the wounds more carefully. The gashes on the flank were not fresh. Those were old scars, layered and deliberate. But the leg and a newer wound along the dog's shoulder were recent and bad. He had seen enough battlefield trauma to know that this animal had perhaps hours left without warmth and intervention. Possibly less. He reached into the pocket of his coat, not the pocket with the pills. The other one. He pulled out what he had been planning to eat as his final meal before taking the bottle. Half a hamburger from the gas station 2 miles up the highway, wrapped in a paper napkin, hard with cold, but still carrying its grease smell. He had thought of it as a last act of ordinary human behavior, a small and pathetic ritual. Here was the last thing Arthur Briggs would taste in this world, a cold hamburger from a gas station. He broke the burger into small pieces. He chewed the largest piece until it softened, then held it to the dog's muzzle. The dog did not move. "Come on," Arthur said quietly. "You're not done yet. Neither am I." He was not sure, in that moment, whether he was talking to the dog or to himself. Perhaps that distinction did not matter. The dog's nostrils flared. Its amber eyes shifted to his face. And then, with tremendous effort and what Arthur could only interpret as a decision, a real, considered decision, the dog lifted its head half an inch off the frozen ground and ate from Arthur's palm. Arthur fed it every piece. He felt the dog's muzzle against his skin, the dry warmth of its breath, the careful way it took each small offering without once snapping or rushing, even in its extremity. When it was done, it lowered its head again. And then it did the thing that Arthur would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who asked him what changed his mind that night. It moved its head, slowly, painfully, with tremendous deliberateness, and pressed it into Arthur's palm. Just that. Just the weight of its broken skull resting in his hand. Its throat produced a sound barely above a vibration, a low rumble that was less a growl than a communication, something in the frequency below language. And Arthur felt the warmth of it against his fingers, and felt the pulse of the animal's blood working against his skin, and understood with absolute and sudden clarity that this creature, this wreck of a dog who had clearly been through something unspeakable, had chosen to trust him. The pill stayed in his pocket that night. Arthur took off his jacket and wrapped it around the dog. He lay down next to it on the frozen concrete and put his arms around its ruined body, sharing what heat a 60-year-old man's body could produce. He did not sleep. He just breathed and listened to the dog breathing and felt the incremental steadying of its heartbeat against his chest. The storm held around the station. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. They were both still alive when morning came. Arthur named him Rex, which means king in Latin, and which had also been the name of the most decorated military working dog in Arthur's unit, a Belgian Malinois who had saved 4 lives and an interpreter in Kandahar before stepping on an IED 6 months before the unit rotated home. It was not a sentimental gesture on Arthur's part. It was a recognition. This dog had served and suffered and been discarded. Whatever had been done to him had been done by people who saw him as expendable. Arthur knew something about that. He spent the following week nursing Rex back to the edges of health using what he could scrape together: stolen antiseptic from a gas station bathroom, strips of clean cloth from a donated shirt, food bought with coins begged outside the supermarket, and an enormous quantity of patient, worthless presents. He did not know if the dog would live. He treated each day as a complete thing, a small contained mission, and did not let himself look further than that. Rex survived, and in surviving, without either of them fully understanding the mechanism of it, he gave Arthur a reason to do the same. The converted camper van sat at the end of a gravel lane on the western edge of Coldwater Hollow, half hidden by a stand of old birches that had grown up around an abandoned lot the town had stopped maintaining sometime in the 1990s. The van had belonged to a man who died without relatives, and the attorney who handled his estate had looked the other way when Arthur began parking there 5 years ago, partly out of legal indifference, and partly because he had seen Arthur clear 3 seasons of brush from the adjacent lot without being asked, and people who work quietly without reward are difficult to dislike. It was small. It was cold in winter and airless in summer. The generator ran on fuel Arthur earned doing odd jobs, clearing gutters, splitting wood, hauling trash for the hardware store 3 days a week. It had a propane burner and a narrow cot and a window over the rear door that let in exactly 1 rectangle of morning light. Arthur loved it. It was the first place in 14 years that felt, in the specific way that matters, like his. Rex had grown old in it, in the way that big working dogs age, not gradually, but in discrete stages, as if aging is something they do deliberately and all at once between one season and the next. He was 8 now, which is old for a German shepherd and ancient for one who had lived the way Rex had lived. His muzzle had gone almost entirely silver. The notch in his left ear was a permanent punctuation mark on his expression. He moved with the considered economy of a creature who has learned that there is no movement worth making that isn't necessary, and every movement worth making is worth making completely. His PTSD, because that is the correct clinical term for what some working dogs develop after years of combat deployment, had been bad in the early days. He could not be touched without warning. Sudden sounds sent him rigid and trembling, his eyes gone flat and far away, somewhere in a different country, a different year. Arthur had worked with him the way Arthur knew how to work with trauma, slowly and with consistency and without expectation. The same things that had helped Arthur helped Rex. Routine, quiet, the absence of performance. By the end of the first year, Rex could sleep without startling. By the end of the second, he would voluntarily lay his head in Arthur's lap in the evenings when Arthur sat outside in the folding chair and watched the light leave the sky. By year 3, he had begun doing the thing that struck Arthur as the most remarkable behavioral shift he had ever witnessed in a living being. He had started to play. Small play. Stiff-jointed and dignified, with a stick or a pine cone, in the way that old soldiers sometimes laugh at bad jokes, as if they are giving themselves permission to do something they had forgotten how to do. Arthur watched Rex recover and understood, with the quiet certitude of a man who has had a great deal of time to think, that watching someone else come back from the edge of nothing makes your own edge feel a little less steep. The girl appeared in the second year. Her name was Sarah Chun, and she was 10 years old and an orphan in the technical sense. Her parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and she now lived with her maternal grandmother in a small house 3 blocks from the edge of town. She was not technically a stray, but she had the quality that strays have, of moving through spaces as if she is not sure whether she is wanted in them, of approaching things sideways rather than directly. She had approached Rex sideways too, the first time, holding out a biscuit from 4 feet away, her arm fully extended and her body angled slightly, as if preparing to bolt. Rex had regarded her for a long moment with his amber eyes, had assessed the situation with whatever extraordinary social intelligence German shepherds carry in their DNA, and had then walked forward with tremendous dignity and taken the biscuit from her hand without touching her fingers. She had come back every day since. She brought food, not fancy food, just things she could acquire quietly from the school cafeteria or the church pantry where her grandmother volunteered on Thursdays. A bread roll, a wrapped cheese slice, sometimes a hard-boiled egg. She placed these items on the wooden crate outside Arthur's van with a solemnity that Arthur found both deeply touching and quietly devastating, because it was the solemnity of a child who has learned that kindness must be performed carefully and without noise, lest someone take it away. In return, Rex performed his one reliable party trick. He would sit and offer a paw, and hold it out with an expression of such strained patience and dignity that Sarah always laughed, and the sound of a child laughing in the thin autumn air near the old birches was, Arthur thought, about as close to church as he was likely to get. These were the good years. Clean and simple and small, the way good years often are. But Sheriff Dale Miller had been watching. Miller had been the law in Coldwater Hollow for 11 years, which is long enough in a small town for a man to become the landscape rather than a figure in it. He was heavy-jowled and deliberate in his movements, with the physical presence of a man who has never had to hurry because the world has always waited for him. He drove the same truck he had driven for 7 years, a black F-250 with a cracked passenger side mirror that he had never bothered to fix, not because he couldn't afford to, but because it communicated something he wished to communicate about a man who does not have to maintain appearances for anyone. He did not like Arthur Briggs. He had not liked him from the beginning, when Arthur had first materialized at the station and failed to move along when encouraged to. Miller liked Coldwater Hollow to contain exactly the kind of people it had always contained, and a decorated veteran with PTSD and no fixed address, and a disturbing habit of looking at things too directly was not that kind of person. More specifically, Miller did not like the way Arthur looked at the trucks that came down the logging road at the south edge of town on Thursday nights. Arthur's camp was just close enough to the birch line that he could hear them, and he had the habit, old soldier's habit, of noting traffic patterns that broke the baseline rhythm of a place. He had mentioned it once to Sarah's grandmother, without suspecting what the information meant. The mention had gotten back to Miller. "He needs to move along," Miller told his deputy, Tommy Walsh, one morning over coffee at the diner. He said it the way you say something you've already decided. Before winter. Tommy Walsh was 24 and afraid of Miller in the specific way that weak people are afraid of strong ones. Not in the healthy way that produces caution, but in the unhealthy way that produces compliance. He nodded and wrote nothing down, because this was not the kind of thing you wrote down. "And the dog," Miller added, picking up his mug. "That dog's been a nuisance long enough." It was the first week of December, and the wood supply at the van was running low. Arthur had been meaning for weeks to make a run up the logging road to the deadfall stretch he had found in the summer, where a section of old-growth pine had come down in a July storm and dried into ideal firewood through the autumn. He had put it off because his hip had been bad, and because the logging road was 3 miles of rough going, and because Rex's joints were worse in the cold and the old boy had been moving stiffly. But the temperature had dropped 12 degrees in 2 days, and there was no putting it off any longer. They set out at first light on a Tuesday, Arthur with the handcart and the splitting maul, Rex moving beside him with the focused attentiveness that working dogs never entirely lose, no matter how many years of civilian life soften their edges. The logging road was empty and silent, the ruts frozen solid, the birches on either side stripped bare and white as bones against the gray morning sky. Arthur's breath came in clouds. The only sounds were the scrape of the cart wheels, the creak of frozen branches, and the particular deep silence of a forest that knows it is being washed by winter. Rex found the cave. He was not searching for it. He had ranged 20 feet off the road to investigate the smell of something, and Arthur had lost sight of him for less than a minute behind a collapsed section of old stone wall overgrown with dead vines. Then he heard Rex doing the thing he did when he found something significant, not barking, not growling, but producing a sustained, low-frequency sound that vibrated in his chest and carried without volume, the canine equivalent of a hand on the shoulder. Arthur followed him. The cave was less a natural formation than a worked space. What had once been a mine entrance, sealed with old timber framing that had been recently reinforced with new 2x4s that still showed the pale yellow color of fresh-cut pine. The door was padlocked, but the padlock was not engaged. Someone had been here recently and had left in a hurry. The door stood open 2 inches. Rex did not go inside. He stood with his nose at the gap and his body rigid and his tail absolutely still, the way a pointer holds a bird, indicating, not asserting. Arthur had been in enough places in the world where you should not open a door that you do not own to know that this was one of those places. And yet the soldier's instinct, the stubborn, incorrigible need to know what is on the other side, had never left him. He put on his gloves. He opened the door. The cave extended back 20 feet into the hillside, and it had been fitted out with shelving along both walls. On the shelves were stacked crates, some of which had ventilation holes drilled into them. Ventilation holes that, when Arthur leaned close, produced the smell of animals and the sound of small, frightened movement. In the back left corner, stacked under a tarpaulin, were 3 cardboard boxes with packing tape around them that had been opened and resealed multiple times. Arthur had seen boxes like these before, in a different country, and he recognized the way they had been packed. On the floor, visible under the edge of the tarpaulin, was the corner of a ledger. Black cover, wire binding, Arthur pulled it out. He read 3 pages before he understood what he was looking at. The ledger was a transaction record. Dates, quantities, code names, dollar. Amounts in the tens of thousands. The code names were thin, cargo for the animals, the pit for what was clearly a fighting arena, the sheriff as a line item in the expenditure column. Receipt confirmed. Services rendered. Payment made. Arthur's hands were not shaking when he read it. That was something he had noticed about himself over the years. That genuine danger produced not fear, but a kind of cold clarity, a narrowing of the world to its essential components. He photographed 12 pages with the cracked screen phone he kept charged at the hardware store. He put the ledger back exactly where he had found it. He was nearly back to the door when his boot caught a rusted metal ring bolted to the cave floor, an anchor point, the kind used to secure heavy cable, and he went down, hard, onto the shelving. A crate struck the ground with a crash that seemed, in the dense silence of that hillside, as loud as a rifle shot. Something inside it shrieked. Arthur was on his feet in 3 seconds. He was out the door in 5. He did not run. Running on this terrain with his hip would end him. But he moved with a speed and purpose that startled Rex into matching his pace. And they were around the curve of the logging road and into the birch cover before Arthur heard the sound he had been dreading. The distant turnover of a truck engine, somewhere below the hillside, coming to life. He did not see who had been waiting, but he heard the door of the cave being pushed fully open, and he heard boots on frozen ground, and he heard a voice, a flat, authoritative voice he recognized instantly, say one word into the cold air. Briggs. Not a question, an identification. Miller had seen him, his coat, his height, the unmistakable shape of him on a logging road, too close to something that was never supposed to be found. Arthur walked faster. Rex pressed against his leg, silent and steady as a wall. The notice arrived at the van the next morning, pinned to the door with a single thumbtack. It was on official sheriff's department letterhead, and it cited a county ordinance regarding unregistered animals involved in livestock incidents. And it stated that one male German shepherd, approximately 8 years of age, gray-muzzled, with a notch in the left ear, had been identified as responsible for an attack on a neighbor's goat, and would be taken into county custody pending investigation and potential destruction. It was signed by Deputy Thomas Walsh. Arthur stood holding the notice for a long time. Rex sat beside him and watched his face with the particular attentiveness that dogs reserve for moments when their person is trying not to fall apart. "It's not real," Arthur told him, which was true. He had not taken Rex near any livestock in 6 months, and his nearest neighbor with goats was 4 miles away. But the piece of paper in his hands was real, and the county's authority to act on it was real, and Miller was real, and the gap between what was right and what would happen was, in Coldwater Hollow, exactly the width of a batch. He drove to the county attorney's office, or tried to. The door was locked, the hours of operation clipped to it in a laminated card indicating that the office opened at 9 a.m. on weekdays. It was 7:43. Arthur stood outside for 12 minutes before conceding that this was not the kind of problem that office hours would solve. He drove to the public library to use the computer and found the number for the state police district office, and left a message that was carefully worded and which he suspected would not be returned quickly. Miller's cruiser was at the van when he returned. Walsh was standing by the door, and Rex was on the lead that Arthur kept clipped to the rear bumper. And Rex was not fighting the lead, but was standing absolutely still, his body at the precise angle of an animal that is making calculations. Walsh said nothing. He took the lead from the bumper and opened the rear door of the cruiser and produced a length of chain. He clipped it to Rex's collar with practiced efficiency. Rex stood perfectly still through all of this, watching Arthur's face. Arthur's face said, "Let him go." Arthur's voice said, "This isn't over." Miller stepped out from behind the van. He was unhurried, his thumbs in his belt, wearing the particular expression of a man who has enormous confidence in the distance between himself and consequences. "Afternoon, Briggs," he said. "You should have moved along when I asked." He leaned close enough that Arthur could smell the coffee on his breath and said, quietly, "Come by the station at 7. You can have your dog back. We'll talk." He straightened and tapped the roof of the cruiser with one knuckle. "Where's something warm?" Arthur did not go to the station at 7. He waited until 6:45, then called the state police message line again, and this time was transferred to a live desk, and spoke to someone who confirmed that a detective, Emily Hartwell, had indeed flagged Coldwater Hollow's Miller as a person of interest in a wildlife trafficking investigation and would return his call within 48 hours. 48 hours. Miller's call came at 7:15. He did not waste time. "I've got the dog kenneled up north of town," he said. "Old Prentice Place. You know it. Come alone. Come now. Bring whatever you've got from the hill." A pause. "Come for the dog, Briggs. Or don't, and I'll file the destruction order tonight." Arthur put on his warmest coat. He transferred the photographs from his phone to a printed sheet he ran at the library's overnight kiosk, and he folded them into the lining of his boot. He did not intend to give Miller anything, but he intended to find Rex. The Prentice logging camp was 11 miles north of town and had not been operational since the mid-90s. The main structure was a low, heavy-timbered building that had once served as a processing shed and bunkhouse combined, and which was still standing in the way that things stand when they are built to survive weather that kills ordinary structures. Not gracefully, but with the blunt, ugly endurance of pure function. The generator inside had been running recently. One small window glowed. The storm arrived as Arthur walked the last quarter mile from the road. The Weather Service had been predicting it for 2 days. A hard front moving down from Canada, the kind that turns Coldwater Hollow's hills into something from a different, more dangerous century. It hit with the characteristic suddenness of high-altitude systems, the wind going from 10 miles per hour to 30 in less than 2 minutes, the temperature dropping as if someone had opened a freezer door the size of the horizon. Miller was waiting inside with 2 men Arthur did not recognize, both large and both wearing the particular blank expression of hired labor that does not ask questions. Rex was not there. Arthur understood in the first 3 seconds. There were no questions and no negotiations. The men held him while Miller searched his coat and boots, found the printed photographs in the lining, pocketed them, and then hit Arthur twice. Once in the kidney with a short, professional punch and once, more slowly, with his fist wrapped around the barrel of his service weapon across the lower left leg, just below the knee. The sound was immediate and specific. The pain that followed was absolute. Arthur did not make a sound, not because he was stoic, because sound requires the expenditure of energy, and he was already calculating what he had and what it would need to buy him. Miller crouched in front of him as he lay on the floor. "The dog's in the kennel. It'll be dead by tomorrow. You'll be here." He looked around the shed. The wind was screaming now, pressing itself through every gap in the old walls. Place like this, time like this, man like you. Nobody questions frozen. He stood up. "Nothing personal, Arthur. You just had bad timing." The generator cut out at some point in the next hour, taking the light with it. Miller and the men were gone before that, and they had taken the kerosene lamp that had been the room's only other light source, and they had chained the door with a padlock on the outside, and they had taken Arthur's phone. The temperature in the shed was already below freezing. Arthur lay on the concrete floor and breathed carefully, the way he had been trained to breathe in pain, through the nose, slow and deliberate, the body's energy treated as a resource to be rationed. His leg was broken, not severely. He could feel the location of the break, midshaft fibula, the kind of fracture that is excruciating and disabling, but not structurally catastrophic. He could not walk. He could move himself, slowly, across the floor. He moved himself to the wall farthest from the door and used a section of collapsed shelving to prop himself upright. The cold was not the dramatic, theatrical cold of fiction. It was quiet and methodical, working its way through his coat from the bottom up, finding the damp places and the thin places and taking them first. His hands were the first to go truly numb, despite the gloves. His feet went next. He thought about Rex. He thought about Miller putting Rex in a cage somewhere and filing a destruction order and some deputy executing it in the morning with the bored efficiency of municipal paperwork. He thought about Sarah putting a roll on the crate outside the van and finding no one there. He thought about the night at the station 5 years ago and the weight of the dog's head in his palm. "Don't you die," he said to Rex, to the darkness, to the howling wind. "Don't you dare die before I get there." He did not know that Rex was already running. The Coldwater Hollow Sheriff's Department was housed in a converted storefront on Main Street with 3 holding cells at the back and a single kennel cage in a corridor between the bullpen and the break room. A cage designed for temporary holding of impounded animals before transfer to the county facility. It was chain link, 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, with a latch that required rotating a handle 90 degrees and then pulling outward. Rex had been a working military dog for 4 years before his injury. He had been trained in obstacle navigation, perimeter breach, and what the official U.S. Army Working Dog Program calls controlled aggression modulation, the ability to switch between passive utility and explosive action based on handler command. He had also, over the course of his career, developed what his original handler called a mechanical curiosity, an interest in how things work that expressed itself in an unnerving ability to manipulate latches, handles, and closures with his paws and muzzle. Walsh had closed the kennel latch. He had not twisted it. Rex had been still in the cage for 4 hours, which is long enough for a human guard to relax into the assumption that stillness means passive. He had been still in the way that experienced working dogs are still when they are thinking, not inert, but present, fully present, the entire attention of a trained and intelligent animal focused on a specific problem. He had tested the latch 3 times at intervals of 90 minutes, applying graduated force to find the pivot point, and by the 3rd test he understood what was required. At 10:47 p.m., with Walsh in the break room watching football with the volume up, Rex stood at the cage door, placed his right paw against the latch handle at the specific angle the testing had identified, and pushed down and outward in a single controlled movement. The latch disengaged. The door swung 3 inches. Rex stood completely still for 6 seconds. Then he pushed through. He moved down the corridor with his nails tucked, the deliberate, rolling gait of an animal that has learned to move quietly on hard floors. He passed the break room without stopping. He reached the bullpen, which was empty. On Miller's desk, among a scattering of papers and a half-finished coffee cup, was a wire-bound black ledger. Not the one from the cave. That one had been locked in Miller's truck. But this was the backup, a matching ledger, the second copy of the transaction record that Miller had been too confident to bother hiding. Rex had no way of knowing what the ledger contained, but he had been in that room twice before, when Walsh brought him in, and when Miller came through to make a call, and both times Arthur's scent had been strong near that desk. The scent of Arthur's handled objects. The scent of things Arthur needed. Rex picked up the ledger in his jaws, gently, the way he had been trained to retrieve objects, and held it without biting down. He went to the front door. It was a standard lever handle mechanism. He jumped for it, missed, tried again, got purchase, and pulled. The cold hit him like a physical thing. He went through it without hesitation. He stood on the empty sidewalk of Main Street in Coldwater Hollow at 10:52 p.m. and lifted his nose to the wind. The storm was at full force now. The wind driving snow horizontally across the street in waves, the storefronts disappearing and reappearing as the gusts shifted. The temperature was 17 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. Arthur's scent was buried under it all, dispersed and diluted and overlaid with the chemical fog of weather. But Rex had followed Arthur's trail in the Hindu Kush in a sandstorm at 2 in the morning with a bleeding shoulder. And he had found his handler and 4 other soldiers in a dry riverbed 8 kilometers off the expected route. He was 8 years old and half-deaf in one ear, and his left hind leg burned with every stride. He put his nose down and began to run. The logging road was 11 miles from town, and Rex ran it. Not all at once. He ran what his body could sustain, and then he trotted when running became impossible, and when trotting became impossible he walked, and he never stopped. The storm was worst in the open sections between the birch stands, where the wind had a clear corridor and used it, bending the small trees nearly horizontal and filling the ruts in the road with new snow that covered the old ice and made every step a controlled gamble. Rex's paws found the camber of the road beneath the snow the way they had found paths in other countries, in other weather, under the weight of equipment that would have broken most animals. He was 4 miles out when the wolves found him. They were not a large pack, 2 adults, likely a mated pair running the storm edge where prey animals shelter, moving in the particular way of predators that have identified something smaller and compromised. They came out of the birch stand on the left side of the road, pacing Rex at a distance for 300 meters before the larger one. The male, gray-brown with the heavy shoulders of an upland wolf, moved to cut his angle. Rex stopped. He turned to face them. He did not assume a submissive posture, and he did not flee, and he did not do the theatrical threat display of an animal performing for an audience. He stood in the road with the ledger still in his jaws, and his weight dropped to his hindquarters and his damaged left leg forward slightly, and he looked at the male wolf with the direct, unblinking attention of an animal that is not afraid but is making a serious assessment. What happened next happened quickly and was over in under 4 minutes. The male wolf tested him, a fast, probing lunge meant to assess reaction speed rather than commit to contact. Rex did not retreat. He pivoted into the lunge with a precision that years of training had made automatic, and he did something that the wolf had not anticipated. He set down the ledger. He did not drop it. He placed it, carefully, to his left, in a way that freed both his jaws and his full attention. The fight, when it came, was brief and brutal and conclusive. Rex took a gash along his right shoulder, the same shoulder that bore the old scars from the fighting pit, now open again, blood dark in the white snow. The male wolf took something far worse. When it ended, the wolves withdrew into the birches and Rex stood in the road, breathing in great labored heaves, his legs trembling with the specific tremor of overexertion rather than fear. He picked up the ledger. He resumed moving north. The remaining 7 miles took 2 hours. The Prentice camp emerged from the blizzard like a gray bulk that was slightly denser than the surrounding dark. Rex found the door by following the thin thread of Arthur's scent that was still escaping through the gaps in the planking, brought outside by the exchange of cold and slightly warmer air from inside. He circled the building twice, testing each side, and found on the east wall a window whose frame had rotted sufficiently that the latch was mostly decorative. He backed up 6 feet and went through it at a dead run. The window frame exploded inward with a sound that crashed through the silence of the shed and snapped Arthur out of a dangerous half-consciousness that had settled over him in the last hour, the kind of warm, detached drifting that is the last stage before hypothermia becomes irreversible. He saw a shape come through the window in a shower of rotted wood and snow, and for a terrible moment his frozen mind could not parse what it was, and then it resolved into Rex. Rex covered in snow and blood. Rex crossing the floor in 4 strides with snow flying off his coat. Rex pressing his face against Arthur's face and producing a sound from deep in his chest that was not quite a whine and not quite a growl, but something in between. Something urgent and warm and devastatingly present. "Hey," Arthur said. His voice was barely audible. "Hey, buddy." Rex was bleeding from the shoulder. He did not appear to notice. He pushed his whole body against Arthur's, the full length of him, his gray-muzzled head in Arthur's lap, and his heavy body generating whatever warmth a 60-pound dog can generate, which is not much, but which is the difference between a temperature of 31 degrees and 32, and at 31 degrees a man can die, and at 32 degrees he cannot. He licked Arthur's face, not once, repeatedly, methodically, moving from cheek to forehead to chin in a pattern that served the same function as the sound, pulling Arthur's attention back to the present, keeping him on the side of consciousness where actions are still possible. "Good boy," Arthur said, which was completely inadequate. He said it again anyway. "Good boy." He found Sarah's red scarf. He always carried it when he left the van, a habit he had explained to himself as simple warmth, but which was actually a kind of talisman, in his inside coat pocket, still dry. He found the one object he had managed to conceal from Miller's search, not the photographs, which were gone, but the small waterproof USB drive on the keychain inside his second boot lining, which held the 12 photographs as a backup file. He looked at the drive for a moment and then at Rex. "You have to go," he said. Rex stopped licking his face. He looked at Arthur with those amber eyes, and there was in them. Arthur was certain of it and would insist on it for the rest of his life. An absolute and clear comprehension of what was being asked. "You have to go, Rex. You have to get Emily." Emily Hartwell. Arthur had described her to Rex over many evenings in the van, the way lonely people describe the people they hope will help them. He had her name, her department, the way she'd sounded on the phone, professionally skeptical and quietly determined. Rex did not know her name, but he knew the USB drive because Arthur had shown it to him before leaving, the way you show a search dog the article of clothing you want them to trace. And he knew the red scarf because it belonged to Sarah, and Sarah's grandmother knew Emily Hartwell, because Emily had been quietly asking questions about Miller for 3 months, and Sarah's grandmother's address was less than half a mile from the state police district office. It was not a plan so much as a prayer with steps. Arthur tied the USB drive and the scarf to Rex's collar with the remaining strap of his bootlace. He held Rex's damaged face in both hands, the scarred muzzle, the notched ear, the amber eyes that were looking at him with an expression he could not name but would never forget, and said what he said. "Go find Sarah. Go find Emily. Bring them back." Rex did not move. His body was pressed against Arthur's, and his tail was still, and his chest was heaving with the effort of the run from town, and he did not move. "Rex!" Arthur's voice broke on it. "Just once, just slightly. Please." The dog stood up. He stood very straight, the old military bearing reasserting itself through the years, and the cold, and the blood running down his shoulder. He turned to face the broken window. He turned back once, and looked at Arthur one last time. Then he went through the window and back into the storm. Arthur did not know how long he had. He suspected the answer was less than 2 hours. He managed to drag himself to the debris in the corner of the shed, old burlap sacking, dried timber scraps, the remnants of a broken wooden pallet, and constructed around himself the closest approximation of insulation he could manage with one functional leg and hands that were increasingly operating at reduced competence. He propped the broken leg between two boards and secured it with the last strip of his belt, and he put his hands inside his coat against his sides, and he breathed. He thought about Carol. He had not thought about Carol with anything other than grief for years, but tonight, for reasons he could not entirely explain, he thought about her laughing. The way she laughed at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings when he made terrible eggs and pretended they were good. That specific helpless, involuntary laugh she could never suppress. He let himself think about it without pulling away from it, and it hurt. But the hurt was clean, the way cold water is clean when you have been too long in the dust. He thought about Danny, who was 31 now and living in Sacramento, and who had stopped answering the phone 2 years after the divorce. He thought about the last conversation they had had, which had been terrible, and then he thought, if Rex gets there, if Emily gets here, then maybe. He stopped thinking about maybes and focused on breathing. Outside, 11 miles away, and moving through the worst blizzard in 3 years, Rex ran. Emily Hartwell had been awake since 10 p.m. reviewing the third iteration of the financial trail she had been quietly constructing around Dale Miller for the better part of 4 months, and she was at the point of fatigue where the numbers stopped resolving into patterns and started looking like noise when she heard the scratching at the base of the precinct's outer door. She assumed it was a branch in the wind. She returned to her papers. The scratching continued, not random, not wind-like, but rhythmic and deliberate, the sound of something with agency pressing against the surface. She opened the door. Rex collapsed forward onto the threshold. He did not have the energy for anything dramatic. He simply went down, his legs giving out with the unhurried certainty of a structure that has completed its task, and lay on the precinct floor in a spreading wet of snow melt and blood, and looked up at Emily Hartwell with eyes that were still burning, still entirely, impossibly present in a body that had nothing left in it. Emily knelt beside him immediately. She was trained in field first aid, but she was not a vet, and for one terrible moment her hands were on the dog and her mind was already composing the worst version of what this meant. A dog who had run himself to death carrying evidence from a dead man. But Rex's chest was still moving, and his eyes were still on her, and she could feel the pulse at his neck, rapid and shallow but there. She found the scarf. She found the USB drive. She had the drive in her laptop in 45 seconds. She was calling in the emergency mobilization order at 46, with the photographs open on her screen and her free hand pressed flat against Rex's side, feeling his heart work. "Stay," she told him. It was not a command. It was a request. Rex put his head down on the floor. His tail made one motion. 1. Emily had the state emergency services dispatcher and 2 state police units patched into her call in under 4 minutes. She described the Prentice logging camp, the victim, the medical emergency, the weather conditions. She described the black ledger in Rex's jaws, which she had not yet opened and read, but which she could already see was identical in format to the financial documents she had been analyzing for 4 months. The search and rescue team were wheels up in 8 minutes. Emily rode with them, and Rex rode in the back of the rescue vehicle, wrapped in a thermal blanket and 4-line running saline, his eyes opening and closing with the irregular cadence of a living thing still deciding. The storm peaked at midnight. The rescue team's vehicles fought their way up the logging road with chains, the GPS useless in the interference, and the lead driver navigating by the physical memory of roads she had driven in summer. Emily sat with her hands on Rex's side and her eyes on the dark windows, watching the pine trees become shapes and then resolve back into darkness, and said nothing. They found the camp at 12:22 a.m. Arthur was alive. He was not responsive in the standard neurological sense when they reached him, but he was breathing, and his heart was beating, and when the paramedic pressed warm gloves against his face and said his name, his eyes opened, slowly, like something underwater, and focused, and he said one word. "Rex." "He's okay," Emily said from the doorway. "He's in the truck." "He's okay, Arthur." Arthur closed his eyes again, and the paramedics went to work. Miller discovered the ledger was missing at 12:40 a.m. He had returned to the precinct to retrieve it. He had made a decision, sometime in the previous hour, that the ledger needed to disappear, that the evidence in the cave needed to disappear, that a number of things needed to disappear before anyone looked too closely at Coldwater Hollow in the morning. He had not anticipated Rex. He had not, truthfully, given Rex serious consideration at any point in the evening, because Rex was a dog and Miller's capacity to seriously consider the agency of anything he considered beneath him had always been his defining limitation. He found the empty kennel cage. He found the missing ledger. He made the connection with the speed of a man whose instincts are acute even when his judgment is bad, and he got back in his truck and drove north. He arrived at the Prentice camp at 12:51 a.m. The scene he found, the lights of rescue vehicles, the shapes of state police units on the logging road, the sound of radio traffic and medical instruction. He assessed in 3 seconds, and he made the wrong decision, which was the decision that frightened, trapped men with something to lose almost always make. He pulled his service weapon. He got out of the truck. He got 12 feet before Emily's voice cut through the wind from behind one of the cruisers. "Miller, drop it. Drop it now." She had her weapon drawn, and she had 3 troopers flanking her, and she had been waiting for something like this for 4 months. And her voice had in it not drama, but the flat, certain quality of someone who has passed the point of wondering whether they are right. Miller raised his weapon. He was looking at the precinct door, trying to calculate angles, trying to find a route through what his mind was presenting him as a solvable tactical problem. He did not see Rex until Rex was already in the air. Rex came from beside the rescue vehicle, where he had been on his feet, barely on his feet, the thermal blanket still trailing from one leg, the 4 catheters still taped to his foreleg, since the moment Miller's truck had appeared on the road. He covered the distance between himself and Miller at a speed that his damaged leg and his exhausted body had no right to produce. He came in low and fast, and he hit Miller's gun arm at the wrist, and he did not let go. Miller went down. The gun skittered across the ice. Emily was on him in 4 seconds and had the cuffs on in 7, and Rex finally let go and sat back and looked at Miller with those amber eyes without expression, and then turned away because he was done with Miller, and there were more important things to attend to. He walked, slowly and with tremendous dignity and one leg dragging, back to the door of the rescue vehicle where Arthur was being attended to, and he put his paw up on the step of the vehicle, and he waited. The paramedic looked at Emily. Emily said, "Let him in." Rex climbed into the vehicle with what remained of his strength. He lay down on the floor beside the stretcher and put his head against Arthur's hanging hand and closed his eyes. Arthur's fingers moved in his fur. That was enough. The story of Rex and Arthur broke in the local news on December 14th and was on the national wire by December 15th and had been picked up by international outlets in 17 countries by December 16th. It was not the corruption story that people could not stop talking about. Although the corruption story was significant, Miller's arrest led to the dismantling of a regional wildlife trafficking and animal fighting network that had operated across 4 counties for nearly a decade, and to the criminal prosecution of 11 individuals, including 2 sitting elected officials. The animal crates in the cave were opened by state wildlife officers and yielded 14 animals, 4 of them endangered, that were transferred to rehabilitation facilities. The charge sheet was long and the evidence overwhelming, and the trial, when it came, was brief. But it was not the corruption story that made people cry. It was the photograph that Emily took on her phone at 12:57 a.m. on December 14th, in the back of a rescue vehicle on a logging road in a blizzard, and posted to her personal social media account without a filter and without a caption, because she could not think of words adequate to it. In the photograph, a 65-year-old veteran with a broken leg and hypothermia is on a stretcher, wrapped in emergency foil, his eyes closed. His right hand is hanging off the edge of the stretcher, and on the floor beside him, still wearing a thermal blanket and a dried blood trail from shoulder to paw, is a gray-muzzled German shepherd with a notched left ear, his head pressed against the man's open hand, his eyes closed, finally resting. The caption, when Emily added one 6 hours later, was simple. He ran 11 miles in a blizzard to save his person. This is what love looks like. The photograph was shared 400,000 times in the first 24 hours. News outlets began tracing the history. The station 5 years ago, the hamburger, the mutual wreckage of two beings who had found each other at the precise moment when each was about to stop trying. A journalist in New York found Arthur's service record and wrote a piece that was technically about PTSD policy, but was actually about a man who had served his country and been left in a rail station to die, and about what it meant that an abandoned military dog had saved him and been saved by him in return. A journalist in London wrote a piece about Rex's service record. He had been a decorated military working dog, loaned to a private handler after injury and sold, illegally, through a broker connected to Miller's network, to the fighting ring where Arthur had first found him. The working dog community was particularly vocal. Veterans organizations were vocal. Animal welfare organizations were vocal. People who were none of these things and had simply seen the photograph were the most vocal of all, because the photograph contained something that arguments and policies and statistics cannot contain: a specific image of a specific love between a specific man and a specific dog. And that love had the quality of all great loves, which is that it is both personal and universal, both particular and complete. Arthur was in the hospital for 11 days. His leg required surgery and 3 weeks in a cast. His core temperature on arrival had been 91 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the threshold above which full recovery is possible and below which it is not guaranteed. He was above the threshold. Rex spent 8 days at the emergency veterinary clinic 2 towns over, where 2 veterinarians and a rotating staff of assistants worked on his shoulder, his paws, the secondary infections that had taken hold in the old pit scars reopened by the wolf encounter, and the dehydration and muscle trauma from the run. He was a difficult patient in the sense that he was uninterested in being still, and he had to be sedated twice for procedures, and the sedation upset him in a way that the veterinary staff found disturbing to witness. The thrashing, the vocalizations, the specific quality of distress that people who have seen combat trauma in animals recognize as something deeper than physical pain. On the 4th day, a hospital administrator arranged for Arthur's bed to be wheeled to the car park entrance, and for Rex to be carried out on a padded stretcher, and for the 2 of them to be placed side by side in the early December sun for 30 minutes, with a blanket over both of them and nothing required of either. Rex put his head on Arthur's chest. Arthur put his hand on Rex's side. They were quiet for 30 minutes. The kind of quiet that is not empty. Sarah Chun arrived at the hospital on the 8th day, brought by her grandmother, carrying a grocery bag that contained 2 bread rolls, a hard-boiled egg, and a length of good sausage she had purchased specifically because she had read that German shepherds like sausage. She stood outside Arthur's room for 3 minutes before knocking because she was not sure she was wanted, in the way that she was often not sure, and then she knocked. Arthur said, "Come in." She stood in the doorway with her bag and her sideways posture and her 10-year-old's careful management of hope, and she said, "I brought food." Rex, who was lying on the bed beside Arthur in violation of approximately every hospital policy, lifted his head and looked at her. His tail, that battle-worn, silver-tipped tail, moved 3 times. Sarah laughed, and the sound of it, in that white hospital room in December, was the same sound it always was in the birch grove by the van. Involuntary and clear and young, the sound of a child who is surprised by joy and cannot contain it, and does not try to. The Coldwater Hollow Town Council voted, on December 30th, to grant Arthur and Rex honorary citizenship, which Arthur accepted with the equanimity of a man who does not put a great deal of stock in official recognitions, but understands that the gesture means something to the people making it. He shook hands with the council members and said thank you and meant it. The small house came from somewhere else entirely. A Veterans Advocacy Foundation whose director had served in the same theater as Arthur, 20 years apart, purchased a house at the edge of Coldwater Hollow, a small place on a corner lot, white clapboard, with a front porch that caught the afternoon sun and a fenced yard where a large, elderly dog could move at his own pace without concern for traffic or weather. The foundation's donation came with enough monthly support to cover utilities and medication and food for both Arthur and Rex for the foreseeable future. Arthur stood in the yard on the first afternoon, in January, with the new snow clean and undisturbed around him and the winter sun pressing on his face with the pale insistence of winter sun everywhere, doing what it can with what it has. Rex stood beside him, always beside him, the way that was his natural position in the world. There was a rectangle of afternoon light on the porch steps. Rex found it after a while and lay down in it, his gray muzzle pointed toward the yard, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and even and clear. Arthur sat down beside him. He put his hand on the old dog's side and felt the heart working there, steady and strong and present, the pulse of an animal who had decided, 5 years ago in a ruined rail station, to trust a man who was trying to disappear and who had held on to that decision through every hard thing that followed. "We made it," Arthur said. Rex's ear rotated once toward his voice. His tail shifted once in the light. They sat together in the January sun, the old soldier and the old dog, two beings who had each reached the end of their rope at the same moment in the same frozen dark and found in each other a reason to hold on. The yard was quiet. The light was thin and clean. Down the block, a child's voice was calling, and there were footsteps on the sidewalk, and somewhere a door opened and closed with the ordinary warmth of a house that has people in it. Arthur did not speak again for a while. He sat with his hand on Rex's side and breathed the cold air and watched the light in the yard, and felt something that he had gone 14 years without feeling. Not happiness, exactly, though happiness was somewhere in it, but something older and simpler than happiness. Belonging. The specific, irreducible sense of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Rex slept in the sun, and outside the white house on the corner lot in Coldwater Hollow, the world continued in its way, complicated and painful and capable, always, in the moments that matter most, of this. Two broken things finding each other in the dark and choosing, against all reason and evidence and despair, to hold on, to get up, to run 11 miles through a blizzard if that is what is asked of you, to be worthy of the hand that fed you when you were dying, to be worthy of the love that chose you when you were nothing. The following spring, a small bronze plaque was installed at the entry to Coldwater Hollow's new animal shelter, built in part with donations that arrived from 41 countries in the weeks after the photograph went around the world. The plaque read, "In honor of Rex, military working dog, #K, 907-441 who ran through the storm so someone else would not have to die alone. And in honor of Arthur Briggs, who fed a dying dog his last meal. And in doing so, fed himself a reason to live." Below the plaque, someone had left a half-eaten hamburger wrapped in a paper napkin. Nobody removed it.